Hello again. In this screencast, we're going to give you a general overview of the events that led up to the Russian Revolution of 1917, when a communist government eventually replaced a monarchy that had been in place for over 3 centuries. What you're seeing here is the Tsar. Tsar, of course, is the Russian version of the old Roman Caesar, or emperor. And Tsarism refers to the state of absolute monarchy in Russia. In this case, the dynasty we're talking about is the Romanov dynasty, which started in 1613 and lasted, as you can see, for over 300 years. This particular Tsar is Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 to 1917. Nicholas represented the idea of autocracy. He was an autocrat, the single authority, like a monarch, like an absolute ruler. He also ruled by way of orthodoxy. Russia was one of the centers of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and as a result, its religious leaders tended to follow rules and tradition that went hand in hand with the power of an absolute monarchy, not unlike the relationships we saw during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Nicholas also represented the idea of national unity. As a single ruler, he wanted his people to follow the same set of beliefs that he did. Except in his case, most of his pastimes were usually above and beyond what the common people of Russia would do. Nicholas liked to play tennis, he enjoyed caviar, he collected fine crystal, and he also enjoyed yachting. You might think back to people like Louis XIV, somebody who would build a fancy palace at Versailles and have 200 courtiers waiting outside his door in the morning hoping they could hand him his socks. That's about the way it was for Nicholas II and his family. Nicholas's troubles began around 1904-1905 when Russia went to war with Japan. The object of the war was control of the Korean peninsula, which you see here. If you can see here from the yellow arrows, the Japanese armies were pretty aggressive in moving against the Russian troops, and overall this war proved to be a disaster for Russia. As a quick aside, the treaty that ultimately settled this war was signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, by President Teddy Roosevelt, who volunteered to mediate between the two sides. Nonetheless, Japan ended up controlling the peninsula, which was pretty much a humiliation for Nicholas II. This didn't sit well with his people, especially since a lot of his people weren't getting enough to eat to start with. On January 9th of 1905, a day known as Bloody Sunday, workers went on strike in St. Petersburg, the winter capital, also known as Petrograd. Their goals? Pretty simple: bread and peace. In this case, peace with Japan. The Tsar's response was to have his army fire on the marchers. Some of you may compare this to the massacre at Kent State University in 1970 in the United States, where National Guardsmen fired on students protesting against the U.S. being involved in the Vietnam War. In this case, however, the death toll was much higher and the wounded toll was much more significant. 200 killed, 800 wounded. That's 1,000 Russians shot down by Russian troops. Out of this Bloody Sunday came the creation of something called the Petrograd Soviet. The word Soviet refers to a workers' council, which should tell you that this is where the communist movement in Russia starts kicking into a higher gear. The chairman of the Petrograd Soviet was a man named Leon Trotsky. As you'll notice here, he's quite the wild-eyed radical, and you'll see more of him a little bit later on. In October of 1905, Nicholas decided to try to please his people by creating an elected parliament. This parliament, known as the Duma, had unlimited power to pass laws, with a couple of exceptions. For example, the Tsar could veto any law that he didn't like. He could also send the Duma home if he wanted to and rule by himself. You may remember Charles I did that in England. Remember how that turned out for him. The Tsar could also make alliances and go to war on his own. So you can see where this Duma, even though elected by the people, really didn't have an awful lot of power, and Nicholas continued to rule as an absolute monarch. The people that lived under him, 80% were peasants. Very much a gap between the haves and the have-nots in Russia in the early 20th century. In fact, many of them not only lived in poverty and a constant state of hunger, but a lot of them still lived as serfs, tied to the land. Think about it for a second. The last time in history you heard about peasants and serfs was during the Middle Ages, 1,000 years before the events here take place. The Tsar also conducted pogroms, which were attacks on Jewish communities. We tend to think of attacks on Jews as something that was exclusive to Hitler during the Holocaust. However, if you know your history, you know that's simply not true. In fact, the pogroms against Jews in the early century served as the basis for stories by a Jewish author named Sholem Aleichem, which later became the basis for the Broadway musical Fiddler on the Roof. Sadly, the real pogroms didn't turn out quite so happy. A lot of Jews were killed, and others were sent out of Russia. Russia entered World War I in 1914. Russia, being the largest population in all of Europe, also mobilized the most troops, over 6.5 million soldiers. Unfortunately, they were also issued only about 4.6 million rifles, meaning that Nicholas was sending troops into battle under-equipped and under-trained. Nicholas ends up going to the front to take charge in person. Meantime, his wife was ruling back in Russia, along with help from somebody named Grigory Rasputin, also known as the Mad Monk. And there he is. Rasputin was an odd character. He seemingly came out of nowhere, apparently had no formal education or very little formal education that anybody could tell. And his status as a monk was certainly questionable also, certainly in the way he conducted himself. He liked food and drink, he loved the ladies, and for some unknown reason the ladies loved him right back. If you look at the eyes, that may be the telling point here. It was said that Rasputin could virtually hypnotize anybody by staring at them. How did such a guy get control over the Tsar's wife and his family? Here's the Tsar's family. The Tsar, of course. His wife Alexandra is here. The youngest daughter whom you see here is Anastasia. Some of you may know that name. But the key for Rasputin is this little fella here in the sailor suit. This is Alexander, or Alexei, as he was called. Alexei was born with hemophilia, a condition which causes the blood to not clot, and therefore any bruising, any cutting of the skin can be dangerous and even deadly. It can be a really painful condition, and as a result, Alexei spent long hours bedridden and in great pain. For whatever reason, Rasputin seemed to be the only person who could bring Alexei any kind of relief. And when Alexandra realized just what Rasputin could do for her son, Rasputin became a major advisor within the cabinet and within the government. So much so that critics of the Tsar often circulated portraits and cartoons like this one, in which Nicholas and Alexandra were almost seen as Rasputin's puppets. Eventually, Rasputin was assassinated under what became some pretty unusual circumstances. A group wanting to eliminate Rasputin and cut off his influence first tried to poison him, supposedly lacing his food with enough poison to kill several people. Apparently it didn't take, as it only made him headachy and upset his stomach. They then pulled out a gun and shot him. And as they were plotting what to do with the body, he stirred and got back up again. Finally, they shot him again, basically beat him to death, or so they thought, weighted his body down and dropped it into an icy river. This finally did the trick. But it's an interesting sidebar and a pretty crazy story to go along with the whole scene with the Tsar. March of 1917. By this time, the Russian army had been in bad shape. They had taken millions upon millions of casualties, even though they'd been only 3 years into the war. When the army joined the anti-Tsar protests, Nicholas realized he couldn't hold on to power any longer. Therefore, he abdicated or stepped down from power. He in fact offered the Tsar's position to his brother Michael, but Michael turned it down, and therefore the Romanov dynasty comes to an end in March of 1917. A temporary government was set up under this man, Alexander Kerensky. Game over, right? Not exactly. In one sense, the revolution was just getting underway. We'll take a look at that in part 2 of our screencast. See you then.